All right, let's talk about one of the biggest geopolitical stories unfolding right now, one that most people aren't even watching. While the headlines stay locked on Ukraine, Gaza, and Taiwan, another transformation is taking shape far from the spotlight. It isn't happening in a battlefield or a capital city. It's happening beneath the ice, and by the time the world wakes up to it, it may already be too late. In 2025, Russia quietly announced what the Kremlin called the final phase of its Arctic transformation. The phrase was vague, but it didn't need to be. By then, the groundwork was already in place. Western analysts scrambled to decode what it meant, but the real shift had already been set in motion. Over the last 5 years, Russia has moved faster in the Arctic than anyone predicted. It has turned this frozen frontier into a stronghold of influence. Fleets of nuclear-powered icebreakers cut paths where few ships dared to travel. Fortified ports sprang up along the northern sea route, stretching from Murmansk to the Bering Strait. Advanced radar systems and underwater surveillance grids extended a watchful eye across this icy corridor. On satellite images, they might look like scattered dots. In reality, they form a chain of sovereignty, a 24,000-kilometer wall across the top of the world. And with every base and every icebreaker, Moscow tightened its grip on a region that was once dismissed as too cold, too remote, too irrelevant. Why the Arctic? The answer is simple: resources, roots, and power. Beneath the ice lies one of the last great energy frontiers, holding roughly 22% of the world's undiscovered oil and gas reserves. That's nearly 90 billion barrels of oil and over 1,600 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. These reserves aren't just potential riches. They're lifelines for a sanctioned economy that needs new revenue streams. And then there's the shipping. As sea ice melts, the Northern Sea Route has opened a shortcut between Europe and Asia that is up to 40% shorter than the Suez Canal. What used to be a dream of polar explorers is now becoming a commercial reality, and Russia has positioned itself not just to benefit from it, but to control it. The numbers tell the story. Back in 2014, only about 4 million tons of cargo moved through the Northern Sea Route. By 2022, the traffic had surged to nearly 38 million tons. By 2023 and 2024, the figures climbed even higher, and forecasts now suggest that by 2030, volumes could exceed 100 million tons. That is a revolution in maritime trade. Every day saved on shipping routes means lower costs, faster deliveries, and bigger profits. For companies squeezed by global competition, that advantage is golden. But Russia isn't just watching it happen, it is weaponizing it. Foreign vessels face steep fees and endless paperwork when they attempt to use the route. Meanwhile, Russian ships receive priority treatment. New ports and service stations along the coast feed billions into Moscow's coffers every year. Each icebreaker escort, each port call, each transit license represents money flowing into the Russian state, money that supports both infrastructure and military ambitions. The Northern Sea Route isn't just a waterway. It's a strategic artery, a financial weapon, and a lever of geopolitical influence. Think about the scale of what's at stake. First, energy dominance. Those untapped Arctic reserves give Russia the chance to rebuild its energy leverage, even as Europe tries to wean itself off Russian oil and gas. Second, transit revenue. Every ship that passes pays Russia in one form or another, turning Arctic waters into a state-controlled toll road. Third, strategic leverage. By controlling the NSR, Moscow gains a new pressure point over Europe and Asia, a tool to apply economic pain without firing a single shot. And finally, narrative power. Within Russia, Arctic dominance reinforces Putin's message of a rising nation, carving its own empire in the cold, indifferent to Western disapproval. While Moscow executed this strategy, Western nations largely stood by. The Arctic had never been a high priority in Washington, Brussels, or London. Policymakers treated it as a region for science, climate talks, and the occasional military drill, not as a theater of power. NATO held exercises in snow and ice, but those were temporary deployments, not permanent investments. Troops trained and then went home. Lessons learned were often forgotten when budgets shifted or media attention moved elsewhere. Unlike Russia, NATO never developed a unified Arctic doctrine. Each member with Arctic territory, Canada, Norway, Denmark, the US, looked at the region through its own lens. Without a shared strategy, NATO had presence, but no permanence. And presence without permanence is easy to outpace. Meanwhile, China pulled up a chair at the polar table. For years, Beijing called itself a near-Arctic state, a phrase many dismissed as harmless rhetoric. But behind the scenes, China was laying down real investments. Research stations appeared on Arctic soil. Fiber optic cables stretched across seabeds. Ice-resistant ships rolled out of Chinese shipyards. Beijing inked deals with Moscow to build ports and infrastructure designed for dual use, commercial on paper, but with clear strategic value. Through what it calls the Polar Silk Road, China folded the Arctic into its broader Belt and Road Initiative, creating a new northern branch of its global network. China doesn't need to control the Northern Sea Route outright. It just needs to make itself indispensable. By financing infrastructure, supplying technology, and committing long-term demand, Beijing ensures that Arctic trade cannot thrive without it. The result is that Russia holds the sovereignty, China holds the financing, and together they shape the Arctic's future. All the while, the West is still debating what that future should even look like. By 2024 and 2025, the alarm finally began to sound. NATO organized Arctic-specific summits. Think tanks issued dire warnings about a new polar power axis. Strategic papers circulated about how to respond. But by then, the bases were already built. The ports were already operational. The shipping lanes were already flowing. Russia and China had already moved in. The West wasn't defeated. It was simply too slow. And this is the deeper lesson. The Arctic didn't change hands with tanks or warships. It shifted with contracts, investments, and quiet construction projects. It wasn't a failure of intelligence. NATO knew what Russia was building. It was a failure of imagination. Leaders could see the changes but couldn't picture the consequences until it was too late. Today, the Northern Sea Route is not just a path through ice. It is a new backbone of global trade. For shipping companies in China, India, and even parts of Europe, it offers shorter voyages, lower costs, and fewer choke points. The Suez Canal, Panama Canal, and even Singapore are bracing for what analysts now call polar leakage, the slow but steady diversion of traffic away from southern hubs toward the Arctic. Insurance companies are rewriting their models. Logistics giants are repositioning fleets. Port economies in Asia and Europe are recalibrating. A once remote frontier is now reshaping global commerce. For Europe, the implications are immediate. Russia gains leverage not only over Arctic gas exports, but also over rare earth minerals and critical supplies needed for green energy transitions. For the United States, the Arctic is becoming a front line of economic positioning, a theater where Washington has fewer assets and weaker partnerships than it does in Asia or the Middle East. For emerging economies like India, Brazil, and Saudi Arabia, the Arctic offers opportunities to align logistics with a new polar reality. Every one of these shifts redistributes influence, one port and one deal at a time. And it all happens without conflict. Russia doesn't need to fire missiles or sail a fleet into battle. It simply decides who gets access, who pays higher fees, who waits for clearance. It can prioritize shipments east instead of west, grant Chinese firms smoother passage while delaying Western ones, or tighten controls on Arctic exports of nickel, rare earths, and liquefied natural gas. These are materials vital to European industry and clean energy. In the age of bottlenecks, whoever controls the choke point controls the game. The tragedy for NATO and its partners is that this wasn't inevitable. It was a missed window. Years ago, the alliance could have coordinated a shared Arctic strategy, establishing permanent bases, building logistics hubs, creating diplomatic frameworks to counter unilateral control of the Northern Sea Route. That didn't happen. The US looked to the Pacific, Europe focused southward, and Canada stayed cautious. The opportunity slipped away. And so, the Arctic became the chessboard of the future, redrawn without a fight. Russia and China didn't need to claim new territory. They rewrote the rules of engagement. They built the infrastructure, established the financing, and let the West watch from the sidelines. Now the question is, what comes next? Will Western nations coordinate, innovate, and invest fast enough to regain influence? Or will the Arctic become the cold line dividing tomorrow's economic superpowers? One thing is certain. The era of hesitation is over. The Arctic is no longer a frozen wilderness. It is a live theater of strategy, commerce, and power. And in this cold new world, the future belongs to those who act, not those who wait. And that's where we'll leave it today. The Arctic story is still unfolding. The ice is still melting, and with it, the balance of global power is shifting. The nations that prepare now will define the decades ahead. The nations that hesitate will be left behind. The choice is no longer about whether the Arctic matters. The only question left is, who will lead in the new world that rises from the ice?